Blade is maybe one of the weirdest comic characters to talk about when you're comparing pop culture relevance and publication history. What I mean by that is if you're watching this now, you likely know who Blade is, likely from his very popular films or maybe just from cultural osmosis. If you're younger, maybe you've heard about his upcoming big budget game, or you've heard about the long boiling MCU Blade film. If you're deeper in, maybe you know about his short-lived TV series or his anime, the list goes on. But regardless of who you are, it's probable that if you've engaged in conversation about the guy, it hasn't been about his, well, comic books. Now, obviously, detailed knowledge of comics is not the average person's area of expertise, but I'm hard pressed to think of a character who has maintained such popularity as Blade that hasn't coincided with at least one of his comic stories breaking through the public consciousness, especially one who rose to prominence before the rise of the cinematic universe, necessitating thousands of listicles to explain what things are. But to go back, all the characters of his milieu have something people out there know. All-Star Superman, Frank Miller Daredevil, Dark Phoenix Saga, Old Man Logan, Ultimate Spider-Man, and Ultimate Spider-Man. I could name like 5 different Batman stories here, but not a Blade one. Why? Simple answer, actually. For a long time, there just wasn't one that worked. Now, I don't say that to single out any creators or discredit them. Many of these books are perfectly readable, but they are often cut off at the knee, with the longest being 12 issues, and some making writer changes in the middle of their already short runs. Painting a picture of a lot of creatives sort of just trying to make it work, but never really having the leeway to do so, culminating for a long time with the last Blade solo closing out its run in 2007. And that was it for Blade, for a hot minute. This brings us to 2023, the 50th anniversary of Blade as a character, and alongside a long-simmering miniseries with the daughter of Blade, and some faux progress on a still upcoming film. A new ongoing Blade book began releasing from writer Brian Hill and primary artist Elena Casagrande. And this one is the winner. Now, on the surface, you might see this now finished series alongside the rest, and think to yourself that there isn't anything trend-breaking here. Just another 10-issue attempt that was gone as quickly as it appeared. But this series approaches its length with a certain intention, knowing exactly how much space the story needed to execute, and pacing it perfectly. Honestly, a large aspect of what makes this series such an easy bridge from the popularity of the films is its filmic approach, that's greatly supported by Hill's history in writing for film and television. So, the plot itself is relatively simple. Blade accidentally helps unleash an ancient evil, being called the Adana, and must defeat it but is unequipped to do so, and thus he must go on a journey in order to become the version of himself that can defeat her, before she can do any harm to humanity. What then becomes the interesting part of this series is the way Blade's world is fleshed out and where this journey leaves him by the end. In the first half, Blade is shown to be confident to a fault, taking missions at face value and basically just slicing through anything in his way to complete them, ultimately leading to this confidence shifting into carelessness and releasing the Adana via a girl he was told to protect. This mentality persists through the first half of this book, as the journey Blade sets off to pursue is intended to be one centered around finding the biggest and best weapon, an attempt to continue to simply slice through everything in his path. In this first act, we are introduced to a few new characters that help flesh out Blade's world, as well as appeal to different aspects of himself. First of these is Tanaka, a leader in the underworld of werewolves, who, honestly, if you had told me that this was a character that had already existed prior to this series and my own research, I would have believed you. Tanaka helps Blade's connection to the underworld feel lived in, appealing solely to that aspect of his character, the cocky side focused on hunting and missions. On the other side of things is Ratha, a young girl from a family dedicated to keeping the Adana contained, whose unleashing led to the death of many of her family members, giving her a personal stake in this plot. Ratha initially kind of serves as just another tool for Blade to use, but inside there lies an appeal to Blade's human side, someone whose life has been impacted in a similar way by similar forces to his own, making a sense of protection bubble up inside of Blade. Lastly, once the plot's ball is rolling in issue 2, we meet Tulip, a former lover of Blade's but also an arms dealer aware of these underworld happenings, causing her to be one of the only characters in the book who is really aware of both these sides of him. These three help paint a picture of Blade's current state and the damage his current mentality causes him. Tanaka easily fools Blade into taking a mission unleashing the Adana. Ratha becomes split between being useful for his goal, but also keeps his eye off the ball because of an increasing desire to make sure she remains safe. Tulip ends up in the crossfire due to her emotional ties to Blade. A night spent together leading to her kidnapping and her choice to stay involved after rescue leads to a demon being attached to her soul. This all comes to a head in the end of the first half of the book, with Blade choosing to come guns blazing with the biggest, strongest weapon designed specifically for killing the Adana. And he still loses. It's still not enough. There's still something missing. and the Adana is able to enact the first part of her plan, a primordial wave that transforms humans across the world into supernatural beings. Before we get to talking about the second half of the series, I want to pause to talk about the Adana a little bit, because I've only really mentioned her in passing up until now. I think she's subtly a really fascinating villain. First off, in terms of her design, she's giving major skinless Claire Higgins and Hellraiser 2 vibes, meeting a more hella attitude. Very cool, love it, no notes. But even beyond an aesthetic coolness, I find her goals fascinating. On the surface, she sort of aims for a typical kill all humans, let the monsters roam free mission statement, but it's also more than that in a small way. She's not really fully just interested in sublimating humanity, but more so aiming to create freedom for everything deemed evil, not just her cohort of big bad evils. There's a space she wants to create, even for those that may be innocent in the supernatural underworld. And while I don't have a grand thesis with this part, I just think she's an interesting villain to potentially keep your eye on, and I think you could do a lot with her in the future and would love for people to try. Blade exists at somewhat of a distance from both of his selves, never fully embracing his humanity or his monstrousness, mostly existing as a means to an end, a vessel for vampires to die. This distance can often enhance his ability to his job, certainly for simple missions and killing lowly monsters, but following another failed attempt to destroy the Adana, there's a sudden realization that there must be more than the ability to kill and the best weapon to do it. Leading us into the second half of the series, specifically with issues 6 to 8, which in my humble opinion are the best character work Blade has gotten in a long time. Issue 6 finds Blade with only Dracula to turn to, who turns the subtext to text and reiterates that Blade's distance from himself is what caused him to fail. Following a trial, Blade drinks the blood of Dracula, granting him an expanded power set. Something that stands out to me about this issue is that Dracula refers to Blade as Eric, which on its own is already abnormal for a character in a Blade comic. But he only uses it after Blade has embraced his vampirism. It ends up tying nicely into what I was talking about earlier in regards to the Adana and perception of evil, because that's the major conceit here. Dracula muses on about how he is perceived as evil, and that perception is something that Blade must submit into and become. Which in itself is a common thing in stories like this. Most characters who have a hidden power aspect of themselves in this way must eventually contend with that in order to become a better hero, yada yada. But I like the way it's framed in this run, paired alongside the Adana's less clear-cut evil role. It helps play a little bit with the audience perception going in, which is likely to view a character like Blade as a human struggling with vampirism, rather than a vampire struggling with humanism. Because ultimately we are meant to view his actions as being helpful to humanity. When paired with the Adana's goal to help her people, it makes the topic of what is actually evil less clear. It helps add texture to her character despite how little we actually spend time with her, which in turn adds potential for further developments of her. Issue 7 is a crossover with the Hulk, lifting from the status quo of Philip Kennedy Johnson's Incredible Hulk run, which is from the little of what I've read of it, aiming for a horror-tinged scary happenings in the South vibe, which is the world that Blade is going to be jumping into here. I'm not typically much of a Hulk reader beyond like Immortal Hulk, but this team works really well for me following the last issue's plot. Hulk has lessons to teach about duality and balance to Blade, and Blade continuously must invite evil inside himself and maintain that self-control to help innocence. But where it really makes this issue shine for me is honestly a bit of the elephant in the room in terms of what I've talked about here thus far, and that's the art. In this issue specifically, how it adds these purples and greens to the color palette to accommodate Hulk's presence while looking cohesive with the series as a whole. Honestly, with how cohesive this book looks, I was shocked at how many cooks were in the kitchen here. Most prominently, the previously mentioned Elena Casagrande does great work here on all the covers and a bulk of issues, with a style that's great to start the series off because it feels so filmic. Beautiful, wide, establishing shots and swift action that feels right at home with the visual language we tend to attribute to Blade. Valentina Pinti also works on a good chunk of this series with a style that features more exaggerated expressions, leading a tad cartoonier than Casagrande, but still feeling at home within the series. Lee Ferguson has a one-off fill-in with issue 6, and does a perfectly good job fitting in with the amount of space he has to show off. I think about this intro page with the location text and a splash of blood a lot. It's one of the most striking images from the series to me, but it cannot be understated how much of a glue for this series' visual identity is the colorists. Kicking off for 2 issues with Jordi Belair before KJ Diaz picks it up for the rest of the series, and they both just capture the colors of sunsets, sunrises, and nights so beautifully. There's this certain grainy texture that makes the atmosphere so thick so that when the action breaks out, it creates this stunning effect of gracefully cutting through the tension. The art team just comes together so beautifully for these 10 issues. After licking his wounds and finding balance within himself, Blade must then face the consequences of his lack of responsibility and the trail of bodies that have followed. This hones in on someone who was killed in the first issue. Someone who was at first passed off as just another grunt trying to stop Blade before he realized he was inadvertently freeing the Adana. This person also turns out to be Ruff's father, and so Blade must contend with the fact that every body that hits the floor before he's realized he's made a mistake has a context to it, that it isn't just consequenceless collateral, and going forward, Blade actually has to consider that. I won't tell you what happens from here on, because you should read the series yourself, but what I will say is that I love where the series leaves Blade following his little arc. It's cool to see him actually get an arc that feels like it moves the needle on his character going forward, while also just being very fun and kind of translating that filmic plot structure that Blade is at home in. Usually, I also wouldn't bother mentioning this, but immediately following this series, Blade does play a significant role in Marvel's big ol' summer event for 2024, Blood Hunt, which does greatly shift the status quo of vampires as a whole in the Marvel Universe. And the writer of this series does write a really fun mini tie-in for Midnight Suns, which I'm mostly mentioning as excuse to say that Victoria Montesi is in it, and she's really cool, and I need to find an excuse to talk about her one of these days. That aside, Blood Hunt is pretty fun, worth checking out if you have a tolerance for event books. I know plenty don't, so mileage may vary, but spinning out of Blood Hunt, Brian Hill does come back for Blade Red Band, follow-up mini to this series that I have not read yet because I did not want my opinion on it to interfere with the writing of this, but it's worth mentioning that this run does continue in some form. That's all from me today. Happy reading.